The legal system of ancient Babylon, best exemplified by the Code of Hammurabi around 1754 BC under King Hammurabi, represents one of the earliest comprehensive written legal codes. Inscribed on a stele and displayed publicly, the code's 282 laws covered various aspects of daily life, from theft and agriculture to marriage and business dealings, although it served more as a symbolic guide than a practical daily resource. The code did introduce the principle of lex talionis, the law of retaliation, advocating that punishments should match the severity of the offense, encapsulated in the well-known phrase, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This approach not only marked a significant advancement in legal thought aimed at establishing social stability and protecting the vulnerable, but also laid foundational principles that influenced subsequent legal systems, underscoring the sophistication of early Mesopotamian civilization. Hello, welcome to the channel. Back to the Bronze Age this evening. Off we go again. As always, supporting the channel, well, you're already doing that, just by enjoying it, and I do hope that you enjoy it. But a few clicks on the like, subscribe, and perhaps leaving a comment that lets YouTube know you want more people to see it. And if you want to be a real hero, perhaps you'll take a look at the links in the description. But for now, I'd like you to get nice and comfortable. We go all the way back a few thousand years to ancient Babylon. Now, in terms of this initial history of Mesopotamia, it effectively revolves around this relentless, non-stop competition for dominance among the many urban centers. The unit of the metropolis required tribute and military assistance from the cities subjected to it, while leaving their local religious practices and traditions more or less undisturbed. The rulers and conquerors showed equal regard for the rights and customs of the city, and upon the arrival of the ancient Semitic-speaking peoples in the cities of Mesopotamia, their tribal customs were incorporated into the legal systems of these areas. Now, even during the reign of Ashurbanipal and Shamash-shum-ukin, the Babylonians continued to add provisions to their city laws. These provisions allowed groups of up to 20 foreigners to freely enter the city, protected foreign women from enslavement once they were married to Babylonian husbands. Now, the population of Babylonia has always been diverse in terms of ethnicity, even since the most ancient of the ancient times, and there was constant communication between those towns and city centers. But each city had a substantial population of non-native residents. This unrestricted exchange of communication certainly would have led to the convergence of cultural practices. However, it was Hammurabi's exceptional intellect that allowed him to establish Babylon as his capital city and unite his extensive empire through a consistent legal framework. Now, during the era of Hammurabi, the law of the code had largely eliminated all remnants of the smaller tribal customs. The absence of self-help, blood feud, and marriage by capture was at this time mandated by state law. However, primordial elements such as a code of family solidarity, district responsibility, and the principle of lex talionis still persisted. Now, the monarch was a compassionate ruler, readily available to all of his subjects, capable and eager to defend the vulnerable against the most powerful of oppressor. But the authority of the monarch, however, is limited to granting pardons only after personal animosity had been resolved. Judges were also closely monitored, and the option to appeal was also permitted. Now, the entire country was encompassed by feudal estates, overseen by lords, who exercised control over the levy, police force, and other administrative functions. A conventional postal system also existed, and the Pax Babylonica, that is, the Babylonian peace, was so secure that in general ordinary citizens had very few reservations about traveling in their carriage from Babylon to the Mediterranean shore. Now, the code did not just represent a current social norm or preserve traditional legal principles. Indeed, over the course of many centuries, a consistent adherence to the law and a tendency to engage in legal disputes had resulted in the accumulation of extensive collections of past legal actions and court rulings in the archives of each city's temple. Furthermore, the interaction between cities had led to the adoption of similar customs and practices, albeit tweaked and changed a little bit to suit the specific situations, wants, and needs of each city-state. But it was also the widespread use of writing and the constant reliance on written agreements that additionally altered early traditions and set new precedents. Now, there was also this class system, and the code categorized the entire population into 3 different classes, that being the Avilum, the Mushkanu, and the Ardu. I'll just briefly explain what a few of them are, but don't look at it like how we look at the old Indian caste system. It's a little bit different. Now, the Avilum, as we'll start with, was initially a patrician male member of a privileged family who had a complete legal right and whose birth, marriages, and death were often recorded officially. He possessed aristocratic advantages and duties, including the authority to seek revenge for physical harm. But there's a catch. He was also subject to more severe penalties for criminal offenses and lesser wrongdoings, as well as an increased rate of fees and fines. This class consisted of the king, court, higher officials, professionals, and craftsmen. And over time, the phrase gradually lost its significance, and it became more of a simple, polite title. But in the code, it is used to refer to anyone when their social rank is not really relevant. There was no requirement based on property ownership, and it does not seem to be related to race either. Now, that's generally what the Avlum is. But when it comes to the Mushkanu, that's a little bit more of a challenge. Now, the term in time eventually acquired the connotation of a beggar, and this meaning has been transmitted through Aramaic and Hebrew into other contemporary languages. However, while the code did not necessarily consider the Mushkanu to be impoverished, it is possible that it may have just been a person without land. Although they had freedom, they were obliged to receive financial reparation for physical harm, pay reduced fees and penalties, and they even got away with making fewer contributions to the gods. Now, the scarcity of any mentions to this Mushkanu in current records makes it a little speculative to provide more exact details. Now, in terms of the Ardu, that was more easily to identify. It was basically an enslaved individual, considered the property of their master, and they constituted a significantly large social group. They had the ability to get possessions and even possess other slaves, however. That's right, if you were a slave and you had your own money, you could buy your own slaves to do your job. A little complicated, right? Well, the master was also obliged to provide clothing, food, and medical expenses for the Ardu, but retained all recompense received for any harm caused to him. Typically, his owner would arrange for him to marry a female slave, resulting in their offspring being born into slavery. But the owner would usually provide them with a house, along with a farm or even a little business for them to run, and would only collect an annual rent from them. Alternatively, he may choose to get married, but only to a woman who was not a slave, resulting in their children being born free. And if she brought him a dowry, his owner would have no claim to it. However, upon his death, half of his estate would be inherited by the owner. Now, he also had the option to obtain freedom by buying it from his owner, or the Ardu may be emancipated and devoted to a religious institution, or even adopted, after he transitioned from being a commoner to a noble. Now, slaves were acquired through overseas purchases usually, captured during warfare, or just obtained by reducing free individuals to a state of servitude due to debt or criminal activities. In fact, in ancient times it was very common for slaves to simply run off, so you're best to treat your slaves well. Not saying you should have slaves at all, but you know what I'm saying. Now, in terms of if a slave was caught trying to escape, well, the person who captured them was obligated to return them to their owner. Now, according to the Code of Hammurabi, the owner was required to pay a price of 2 shekels to the captor. It was around 10% of the average wage of a slave, the average value, rather. Now, engaging in the act of detaining or sheltering a slave was subject to the penalty of death. And I do think you'll find that there's a lot of things in the Code of Hammurabi that are subject to the penalty of death, but we'll get to them a little bit later. Now, a slave was marked with an identity symbol that could only be removed through a very difficult surgical procedure. Now, this mark, often considered of the name of the slave's owner, either tattooed or branded onto their arm, was of course very difficult to hide. Of course, it's easy to check if you come across some kind of law enforcement or anyone who wants to check your status of a free or enslaved individual. Thus, in Assyria and its subject provinces, there were, however, numerous serfs that resided on large estates, and these serfs were primarily from subject races, settled prisoners, or former slaves, and they were bound to the land they cultivated, sold together with the estate, but nevertheless they had their own ability to own land and property for themselves. Now, there is minimal evidence of serfs in Babylonia in that sense, unless the Mushkenu is considered one of these serf class. Now, on to more religious matters, in terms of how things would run around temples, because of course that is very central to these old times. Well, generally, the deity associated with a city was believed to have dominion over its territory, consisting of a central area of cultivatable land and a surrounding region for grazing. The inhabitants of the city were seen as the deity's tenants, living on the god's land effectively. Now, the deity had a deputy, and that was the monarch, kind of a step down, not exactly as we think of it in the Egyptian sense. Now, the monarch had long stopped interfering with occupancy and were satisfied with predetermined payments in the form of natural resources, livestock, currency, or labor. Now, speaking of livestock, the state claimed a share of all agricultural produce, and that includes crops, livestock as well. Royal messengers also had the authority to requisition property, issuing receipts as proof. Fortunately, we've got a lot of them written down due to cuneiform being quite easy to keep for a long period of time scratched onto those clay tablets. And cities imposed their own taxes, such as duties, customs fees, ferry charges, highway tolls, and even water prices, which is of course quite important and sometimes scarce. Now, this being said, the king did not own all the land, but he did have his own estates, along with personal possessions and the taxes that he had collected from the populace. High-ranking officials were granted endowments, including official houses, in return for personal services to the king. These lands, known as fiefs, were inalienable. They couldn't be sold, they could not be pledged, rented, or diminished in any way. Now, if the fief holder was called abroad, they could appoint a competent son to take over, and if by some chance they had no suitable son available, the state appointed a temporary replacement, while the wife received a portion of the resources for sustenance and that of her children. Now, temples, of course, played their crucial role in society, as they always do, and continue to in our modern world, to varying extents across the globe, of course. But they also generated revenue from properties, tithes, and regular payments, as well as the usual offerings and sacrifices. These offerings included various natural resources, even just straight-up cash, throwing those little coins and all the rest into it, also with durable goods. Large temples were staffed with numerous officials and servants. Initially, each town may have revolved around a single temple as a single deity too, where each household had the right to serve and share in its earnings, and this was also written into the code. You got a little bit of a cut. Everybody was in it together after all. Well, unfortunately, as the towns grew, the privilege of visiting a specific shrine became a kind of ownership that could be collateralized, leased, or even divided among family members, but it could not be transferred to others. Well, despite these obligations, temples served as significant repositories for grain and other goods, and they also housed the city's archives. But temples also had duties of their own, no slacking about, of course, such as providing ransom for citizens captured by enemy forces. After all, they're the ones with the money, and when things hit the fan, well, generally, the temple was asked, or rather told, to give back to the community. Kind of an emergency fund. You imagine if it all worked like that today. If times got really tough, you can just march into your church and say, I can't afford my rent, or I can't afford food. You're putting on a big barbecue for all of us tomorrow night, and there will be takeaway. See you then. It's not a bad idea. Well, they also supported these impoverished farmers by providing interest-free loans for seeds, grains, or even just supplies in general. But the farmers were expected to repay these promptly, especially when that first harvest came. Now, in terms of the king's authority over the temple, it was not possessive, but rather managerial. He may take a loan from it, but he will repay it in the same way as other borrowers. You don't get away with just taking money from the coffers just because you're the king. The tithe appears to have been sent as payment owed to the deity for the use of his land, and of course the king was on that land too. But it is uncertain whether all lands paid tithe, as it is possible that only those with a previous affiliation to the temple did so. Now, in terms of property, the code acknowledges various methods of transferring ownership of property, and is quite advanced for its time. Remember, we're talking almost 3,500 years ago to 4,000 years ago. It's really quite impressive. In terms of the methods of the transfer of ownership, we have sale, lease, barter, gift, dedication, deposit, loan, or pledge, all of which had very extensive contractual arrangements. A sale refers, of course, to the transfer of ownership of a purchased item, such as real estate, in exchange for monetary recompense. This transfer is typically represented by a staff, key, or deed of conveyance, and receipts are provided for both payment and the item. If credit was extended, it was regarded as a debt and obtained as a loan from the seller, with the expectation that the buyer would repay it and provide a bond as collateral. Now, the Code of Hammurabi also emphasized the importance of proper documentation and witness testimony to support any claims, and that is particularly in transactions and property disputes. After all, there's a lot on the line when you're buying and selling a home. Contracts and receipts were crucial for verifying ownership, and failure to produce these documents could result in severe penalties, including accusations of theft, and if it was really bad, they might even kill you. Oh, I know that sounds a little bit harsh, but, well, that's just the way it was. Well, just for example, purchasing property from a minor or a slave without proper documentation could lead to capital punishment, and buyers of stolen property were required to provide their purchase to avoid being held responsible for the theft. So it's best you have all of your paperwork in order. Now, in cases where a buyer purchased a slave or property that was later found to have been unlawfully acquired, they were required to return the property to its rightful owner, and they did not get any compensation. Specific provisions allowed buyers to reject slaves who were found to be sick or unfit within a certain period. A sale could be annulled if there were issues with the title or even hidden liabilities. Now, in terms of agricultural practices, they were heavily regulated too, with landowners often leasing their land to tenants or farmers. The tenant was responsible for maintaining the land, ensuring proper cultivation, and producing an average yield. Now, if a harvest did fail, the tenant was required to reimburse the landowner. In cases of unintentional loss, tenants were still responsible for the land, and both parties would share losses according to their profit-sharing agreement. The code also allowed for barren land to be rented for restorative purposes, with tenants exempt from paying rent, at least for an initial period while they got the ball rolling. Now, in terms of housing leases, while we're talking about rents and all the rest, they were typically annual, and the rent was paid in advance. Tenants were also responsible for maintaining the property. Now, woodwork was generally removable, allowing tenants to take their belongings with them. If a landlord reclaimed the property before the lease term ended, they were required to refund part of the rent. Land could also be leased for construction purposes, with tenants exempt from rent for several years, after which the building would become the property of the landlord. Now, although there were many slaves, there was still a frequent need for hired labor, and in particular during the times of harvest, where labor was the most important. Now, this was a contractual issue, where the employer, who typically paid in advance, may request collateral as a guarantee for the completion of the task. Cattle were employed for tasks such as plowing, operating irrigation machinery, transporting goods, and threshing. The code established a legally mandated salary for individuals who were engaged in sowing, driving oxen, working in the fields, and renting oxen, donkeys, and other similar animals, and you had to pay the minimum amount. Otherwise you'd get in all sorts of trouble. And speaking of these animal commodities, there were of course numerous groups of animals, both herds and flocks. Now the flocks were entrusted to a shepherd, who issued a receipt for them and led them to graze. The code determined his salary too. He had a duty of ensuring proper care and restitution of livestock, namely replacing an ox with another ox and a sheep with another sheep, and ensuring their satisfactory breeding. Any fraudulent utilization of the flock necessitated a restitution that was 10 times the amount, while any loss resulting from illness or predatory animals was the responsibility of the owner. The shepherd fully compensated for any losses resulting from his own negligence, of course, if he admitted to it being his own negligence. If he did let the flock to graze on a field of crops, he was required to compensate for damages 4 times the value. If he allowed them to trample on standing crops when they should have been confined, he had to pay 12 times. Payment in kind was also prevalent in business, although contracts typically included cash and specified the expected currency. And yes, they did have different currencies. So think about Assyrian, Carchemish, Larsa, and of course Babylon. There were a few others. Now, according to the code, it was required that a debtor be permitted to make payment in agricultural products based on a predetermined scale that was set by law. If a debtor possesses neither monetary funds nor agricultural produce, the creditor was then obliged to refrain from declining items as a form of payment. The code explicitly prohibited the seizure of a debtor's grain, and not only was the creditor required to return it, but their unlawful behavior also resulted in the complete forfeiture of their claim. A seizure without proper justification for the sake of collecting debt was also penalized, as was the act of seizing a working ox to satisfy a debt. Now, in the event that a person who owes money was apprehended, They had the option to designate their wife, child, or a slave as a hostage to fulfill the debt through labor. Which is, of course, horrible. Could you imagine? Well, the creditor had the legal right to retain a wife or child as a municipium for a maximum period of 3 years. If the mancipium died of natural causes while under the ownership of the creditor, no legal action could be taken against the creditor. However, if the creditor was responsible for the death due to cruelty, they were required to provide a son as compensation, or pay for a replacement slave. The individual had the ability to trade a captive individual, but was unable to trade a female captive who had given birth to her owner's child. In this case, the owner was required to buy her freedom. In addition to that, the debtor had the option to use his property as collateral, commonly pledging a field, house, or crop in contractual agreements. According to the code, it was also required that the debtor personally harvest the crop and use its proceeds to repay the creditor. In the event of a crop failure, payment was postponed, and no interest may be levied for that particular year. In the event that the debtor did not personally tend to the field, they were required to compensate for its cultivation. However, if the field was already being cultivated, the debtor was obliged to harvest it themselves and settle their obligation using the resulting produce. Failure to obtain a crop would not nullify the cultivator's contract. Now, frequently, pledges were established in cases when the inherent worth of an item matched the value of an obligation. However, antiquatic promise was more prevalent, where, that being the earnings from the pledge, were used to offset an interest on a debt. It is possible for a debtor to use their entire property as security to repay a debt without the creditor physically receiving any of it. In Babylon, it was common for debtors to provide personal guarantees, which ensured that they would return their debts, or the guarantor would become accountable for the loan. Trade, of course, was highly extensive. A typical practice involved a merchant delegating his products or money by a mobile agent, who would then search for a suitable market to sell the commodities. The caravans ventured very much beyond the boundaries of the empire. Well, of course, you couldn't just show up and buy and sell without any records. The code explicitly required that agents meticulously record and provide receipts for every single item they received, with unrecorded items ineligible for claims. They were also obligated to repay double the amount received regardless of profit. If profits were low, the agent had to make up the shortfall, but he was not held accountable for losses due to theft or extortion during travel. Now, upon the agent's return, the lending merchant was required to issue a receipt for the goods. Any fraudulent entry or claim resulted in the agent being penalized threefold, while the lending merchant faced a sixfold penalty. Profits were also typically divided according to the contract, often equally. Of course, caravans were heavily involved in forwarding, where agents received goods in advance. The carrier issued a receipt, assumed full responsibility, and required a receipt upon delivery. And we have thousands of these, by the way. They're all over the place, which is a good and bad thing. Good because we have thousands and thousands of clay tablets that have been preserved. Bad because most of them are extremely boring. Well, cost of doing business, I suppose. Well, if they fail to fulfill the obligation of providing receipts upon delivery, well, they also had a penalty of 5 times the amount owed, and payment was usually made up front. Now, in terms of storage costs, especially for grain, well, they were set at 1/60th, and the warehouse manager was liable for discrepancies, forcing him to pay double for any losses, but only if a witnessed receipt had been provided. Waterborne transport on the Euphrates River and the canal system was of course vital from a very early stage, with vessels contracted for transporting various goods. The code set fixed prices for shipbuilding and required a 1-year seaworthiness guarantee. The ship captain was responsible for both the cargo and the vessel itself, and had to compensate for any losses, even paying a fine if the ship was refloated after sinking. In collisions, the moving boat was held liable for damages, in terms of next to the stationary one. The code also regulated sales of alcohol, which they did have back then. Alcohol was a lot older than you may think. It set the prices for beer and prohibited tavern keepers, typically women by the way, from engaging in disorderly conduct or treasonous gatherings, with violations punishable by death. Tavern keepers were also required to report wrongdoers to the authority, which, if we have this written in the Code of Hammurabi, it implies that there was a well-organized police system. So there's that too. Now, what about banking practices? Well, they included payment by banker or written drafts against deposits, with negotiable bonds for payments. Temples or wealthy landowners rarely charged interest on urgent advances, possibly linked to the earlier Matea system, where borrowers might have been land occupants, etc. But there were some instances of high interest rates ranging from 20 to 30%, which were applied to delinquent loans, and particularly in business dealings. Now, marriage was something that functioned as a transaction of its own, primarily an agreement for two individuals to become a single unit. Typically arranged by families, the groom's father provided the bride price, which the suitor ceremonially offered to the bride's father along with other gifts. The bride price was then transferred to the bride upon marriage and returned to the groom, along with her dowry, which represented her share of the family's wealth. The bride price, of course, varied significantly, mainly based on social status, which always exceeded the value of a slave. If the father accepted the suitor's gifts, but did not deliver his daughter, he was obligated to return everything. If a marriage contract was broken due to slander by the suitor's friend or an acquaintance, the bride price had to be refunded, and the slanderer was prohibited from marrying. Conversely, if the suitor withdrew from the marriage after giving the gifts, he had effectively forfeited them, so no getting cold feet. Now, the dowry may encompass immovable property, but often comprised personal belongings and domestic furnishings. The ownership of the property stayed with the woman during her lifetime. If she had children, they would inherit the property. If she did not have any children, the property would go back to her family. In this case, the husband had the option to subtract the bride price from the property, if it had not been given to the wife, or restore it if it had been. Now, in terms of a marriage ceremony, would that involve the bridegroom accepting the bride by joining hands and reciting a formula of acceptance, such as, "I will provide you with wealth and prosperity. You will be my wife, I will be your husband." And the wife, something along the lines of, "I will provide you children, and I will help you with all the domestic duties," this sort of thing. Doing the vows, of course. Now, the ceremony, however, must be conducted by an individual who was neither enslaved or in any sort of bondage. A freed man had to be witness. The marriage contract, which was esteemed essential by the code, determined the status of the woman as a wife. It typically outlined the repercussions that each party would face if they chose to eventually reject the other. Now, additionally, restrictions may include the expectation that the wife fulfills the role of maidservant to her mother-in-law or to a first wife. Now, the married pair functioned as a unified entity when it came to external obligations, particularly in regards to debt. The man was liable for both his own debts and those incurred by his wife, even before the marriage. I can see how that could become a bit of a problem. I hope there's full disclosure. However, the husband did have the ability to utilize her as collateral. Remember how I explained before that you could give up a wife or a slave or a child if you got into a little bit of trouble? Well, hopefully it never came to that. I'm sure it did plenty of times. A little bit rude, though, don't you think? Well, consequently, the code permitted the inclusion of a condition in the marriage agreement, stating that the wife would not be held liable for her husband's debt prior to marriage. So you couldn't get yourself into debt, then go and marry someone without telling her about the debt, and then simply throw her to your debtor as collateral. You couldn't get away with that. Obviously, it had happened at least one time, because they had to make a law about it. So somebody had the nefarious idea of doing it. Now, it could also be written into marriage contracts, explicitly stated that the husband could not be responsible for the wife's debt prior to marriage, and that both spouses would be jointly responsible for any debts incurred after marriage, regardless of a separation. Now, a man had the option to establish a settlement for his wife by deed or gift, granting her a limited stake in the portion of his property. Or he may also retain the right for her to pass it on to a favored child. But the husband also had the choice to get a divorce, but he was required to return the dowry if this occurred. Additionally, if the wife had given birth to children, she would have custody of them. Subsequently, he was required to allocate to her the revenue generated from the property, together with the necessary resources to sustain herself and their children until they reached adulthood. She also received an equal portion of the allowance with the children, and apparently in his fortune upon death, and had the freedom to remarry. In the absence of children, the man would give back the dowry to the woman and compensate her with an amount equal to the bride price, or 1 mina of silver if no bride price had been established. The latter refers to the typical penalty specified in the contract for his rejection of her. But if the husband could demonstrate that his wife had been an inadequate spouse, the code permitted him to divorce her, retaining custody of the children and the dowry. Alternatively, he had the option to, I guess, demote her to the status of a servant within his own household, ensuring her provision of food and clothing. Which sounds pretty terrible, but, well, it's just the way it is. The wife also had the option to initiate legal proceedings against her husband on grounds of cruelty and neglect, and if she successfully substantiates those claims, she can receive a judicial separation and also retain her dowry. And she's taken the kids, I assume. But the man did not receive any additional form of punishment. If she failed to substantiate her case, yet was proven to be an inadequate spouse, however, she was subject to drowning. So, you better have very good proof. Now, in the event that a husband is absent due to circumstances beyond his control, such as being conscripted into a war, the wife may actually choose to live with another man. However, it's important for her to reunite with her husband once he does get back, and any children from the second relationship would remain with their biological father. If she received financial support, any violation of the marriage bond would be considered adultery. The marriage was terminated without any consequence for the wife due to deliberate abandonment or voluntary absence of the husband. If he came back, she was neither obligated nor allowed to go back to him. Now, in terms of relationships in general, monogamy was pretty much the norm. Now, if a wife was childless, she could offer her maid to bear children, and they would be considered hers in the eyes of the law, though practically they would be somebody else's children. The wife retained control over the maid, who could be demoted to slavery for insolence, but she could not be sold if she had borne children for the wife. If the wife provided a maid, the husband could not take a concubine. If she did not, he was permitted to do so. Now, a concubine was kind of like a second wife, a co-wife, I suppose, albeit of lower status, and the first wife had no legal authority over her. Concubines were free women, by the way, not slaves, and they were often given a dowry, and their children were also legitimate heirs. They could only be divorced under the same conditions as a wife. Temple priests, though they weren't supposed to have children, could get married, and their wives might also provide a maid to bear children. Free women were also allowed to marry slaves, and their children would be free. Upon the slave's death, the wife would take her dowry and half of her couple's acquisitions, with the other half going to the master as the slave's heir. But adoption was also a common practice, particularly when parents were unable to have children, or when their children had grown up and got families of their own. But adopted children were expected to provide for their adoptive parents in old age, explicitly stated in the code, by the way, and this arrangement was formalized through a contract that detailed the obligations and expectations of both parties. If the parents had legitimate children, these children often agreed to relinquish their inheritance rights, sometimes even transferring property to the adopted child to avoid responsibility of caring for the parents. If the adopted child failed to fulfill their duties, the adoption contract could be nullified by the courts. Slaves were also frequently adopted, but if they disobeyed their adoptive families, they could simply be returned back to slavery. Adoption required the consent of the biological parents, who would legally transfer their rights to the adoptive parents, and with that sever all connections. However, certain individuals, such as vestals, palace officials, and slaves, had no rights to their children and could not contest adoptions. Orphans and illegitimate children also lacked guardians to object to their adoption. The law harshly punished ingratitude from adopted children. For example, an adopted child who returned to their biological parents could actually have their eye removed. Didn't see that coming. And the one who denied their adoptive parents could also lose their tongue. Pretty harsh, isn't it? Well, adopted children had the right to inherit their adoptive parents' estate, and could even be designated as the eldest son, which typically made them the primary beneficiary. Upon the father's death, all legitimate children were entitled to an equal share of the inheritance. Provisions were made for unmarried sons who might receive a bride price, and for daughters who might receive a dowry. The father could also bequeath land to favored children. While the eldest son did not have automatic inheritance rights, he often served as executor, ensuring an equitable distribution of the estate, sometimes contributing from his own share. But of course, in ancient times, a father had the complete freedom to disinherit his son without any limitations. However, the code, once that came in, required the approval of a court, and that too only in cases of persistent disrespectful behavior by the son towards his father. He had to be a very, very naughty boy, throwing parties while dad's off fighting the Sumerians and all the rest. That sort of thing. Smoking behind the grain silos. Now that's... that will get you disinherited. Oh, for sure. Now, but of course it could be the other way around too. You see, in the ancient times, before the code, if a son disowned his father, he would have his frontal hair cut and be marked as a slave, which made him eligible for sale. Similarly, if a son disowned his mother, he would have his frontal hair cut too, be publicly paraded around the city as a warning, and be banished from the household. But he would not be reduced to the status of a slave. Now, while we're on the topic of people being very naughty and doing things they're not meant to do, adultery was met with capital punishment for both individuals, and it was drowning. That was the punishment. However, if the husband chose to forgive his wife, the king had the authority to grant clemency to the lover. In cases of incestuous relationships between a mother and son, both individuals were subjected to death by burning. If the incestuous relationship involved a stepmother, the man was disinherited. In the case of a relationship with a daughter, the man was banished. If an incestuous relationship involved a daughter-in-law, the punishment was drowning. Lastly, if the man engaged in a relationship with his son's fiancée, he got off with a fine. That being, well, a bit of an awkward conversation with your son when you go home, I'm afraid. Now, a woman who caused her husband's death for the sake of her lover was publicly executed and displayed on a gibbet. Now, the code also introduced that unique extension of lex talionis, that punishment of equal for equal, such as punishing a creditor's son if the creditor caused the death of a debtor's son. Contracts, particularly marriage contracts, specified death by various means for a wife's repudiation of her husband. Exile was imposed for incest with a daughter, disinheritance for incest with a stepmother, and severe corporal punishment for a brutal assault on a superior. Branding was also used as a penalty for slander, and corrupt judges were permanently deprived of office. But really, fines were the most common punishments, especially for injuries, property damages, or breaches of contract, often involving multiple restitutions. But the code also recognized intent, imposing lighter penalties for unintentional harm. However, carelessness was harshly punished, such as cutting off of a physician's hand for causing the patient's death, or executing a builder whose poor workmanship led to fatal accidents. Evidence was, however, paramount, with a requirement that the criminal be caught in the act, and witness played crucial roles in the trials. In terms of lawsuits, pleas were drafted in writing, and cases involving life and death were tried by a panel of judges and elders. False witnesses, well, they faced the same penalty that the accused would have received if convicted. In cases of doubt, ordeals such as the river ordeal were used to determine guilt. Court decisions were documented, sealed, and witnessed, with copies given to the parties and stored in archives. Appeals to the king were permitted, with Babylon's judges acting as a higher court. Immoral acts not prosecuted in court were also condemned in the omen tablets, with warnings of divine retribution for offenders. How divine will the retribution be? Well, I'm sure they'll find out once they meet whatever gods await them. Well, your presence up to this point has been divine as far as I'm concerned. A little segue there to lead us off. I'd like to thank my top-tier supporters and patrons. There's Dark, Gary, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, and Wendy. Wendy. Thank you very much for watching this far. A fascinating look back into the ancient world. And I'm talking really ancient. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all, and get a good rest.